spending a semester there on a fellowship. Leela Gandhi, my colleague in the English department, will be joining us from London, UK, and she is actually teaching this semester, teaching her Brown class from London. That's possible in the Zoom universe. And two of our student panelists will be joining us from India, one from Shimla and one from Delhi. So let's start. Welcome, Rahul Gandhi.
Thank you.
Brown.
Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to host you, and hope there will be an opportunity to host you in person as well in future. Let me start with a remark that caught my eye. You made 2 weeks back at Cornell. You argued that politics in India, especially electoral politics or politics in general, is no longer a fight for power. Politics in India have become a fight for India, not just a fight for power. Now, we noted in November, during the last presidential election in the United States, that Biden, President of the United States, made a claim which had roughly similar properties, and you'll tell us whether your claim is different. He argued that the election of 2020 was not about a change in power in Washington. It
is many different diverse viewpoints, many different languages, different cultures, different histories, different ideas. What our founding fathers did is they created the architecture for that negotiation. Centerpiece of that architecture, of course, is one man, one vote and the Constitution. And then from that idea of one man, one vote and the Constitution arose many independent institutions which guarantee the negotiation. It's very obvious to me that those institutions are what allow the negotiation between our identities, between our languages, between our cultures, between our states to occur. What I see is a determined attack on those institutions and a capture of those institutions. There are elements of that taking place in the United States. But of course, I'm nobody to comment on the United States. I don't understand the United States as well as my American friends there would. But I get the sense that the American institutions are showing much more resilience than the Indian ones. I get the sense that the American system is actually countering this onslaught better than our system. To me, if the negotiation between these states breaks down, then the idea of India breaks down. Before 2014, there was an assault on institutions, concentration of capital, you can say, but it was subversive. It was being silently done. It was done in Madhya Pradesh. It was done in states that they ran. It was done through the Shishu Mandirs, through their schools. It was done by siphoning off public funds into their schools. But it wasn't out in the open. What's happened is in 2014, it is out in the open, it's legitimized, and it's across the board. And to me, that's why it's an attack on India. See, I represent
judiciary or some other independent institutions.
I'm referring to every single institution. There's not a single institution that is not under this type of assault. I mean, my mic is switched off in Parliament. In the middle of, while I'm giving a speech, it's switched off. Right? So the essence of Parliament is that the country can see what I'm saying. That the TV is showing what is going on in Parliament. The TV doesn't show what's going on in Parliament. Right?
So So whole
So
variety of institutions.
No, I'll elaborate. So
Yeah.
the conversation within Parliament, BJP MPs cannot have an open discussion in Parliament. They tell me that. They're like, हमें तो बस बता दिया जाता है क्या बोलना है. It's a straightforward top-down thing. They cannot go. One BJP MP went.
That you are speaking about is essentially built on diversity and expression of that diversity, right?
Yes, it is built on diversity and expression of that diversity, but more importantly, it is a negotiation between those ideas. It is an active, dynamic, constant negotiation. And that negotiation requires structures for that negotiation to take place.
Okay. So you're defining
when the British was leaving India, the was transfer of power to whom? That was the challenge. Who do you transfer power to? And it was the Congress party that created the environment for the transfer of power. The British were asking a legitimate question in the 20s. They were saying, okay, to whom do we transfer power? Not to the Maharajas, obviously, because the Maharajas were not India. The Maharajas were a divided India which was at war with itself. So the answer to that question came from Mahatma Gandhi and the Congress party. They said, okay, yes, to whom? To the people of India. How? Through Parliament. How? Through the Constitution. And then further development, how? Through these institutions that will protect the voice of the people of India. So it's not just a question of diversity. It's a question of active negotiation taking place between that diversity.
Okay. As a lot of people have noted, this has been an international commentary on this matter. Two of the leading agencies, non-governmental agencies in the world that rate or assess democratic health in the world, the Freedom House and the Varieties of Democracy Institute in Sweden, which has risen to prominence of late, both have downgraded Indian democracy. Freedom House calls India now partly free, not unfree, partly free. And that is after 30 odd years that India has been downgraded. The VDEM Institute in Sweden uses electoral autocracy is the term it has used. Not yet a full autocracy, but electoral autocracy. Now, I have two questions. One, do you agree with this assessment, the assessment of Freedom House? They're roughly in the same direction. They're slightly different, but roughly they're both talking about a steep decline, a steep democratic decline in India. Do you agree with that assessment? And second, VDEM Institute, following political science and its own research, has also said something institutions and then independent institutions. Then the next step, normally, there is no law about this. There is a tendency. Then the next step, normally, there is no law about this. There is a tendency they're talking about. The next step after an attack on civil liberties, an attack on civil society, an attack on independent institutions, next step is typically an attack on elections itself. So the second question after the first question, which is about, do you agree with these two agencies? The second question is,
election is about a debate that is taking place in Parliament. Right, so you need those things for the vote to count. You know, Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi used to have elections. They used to win them. They were actually voting. It wasn't that they weren't voting, but there was no institutional framework to protect that vote. So to me, India's going to legitimization of the vote. I mean, there's no reason Saddam Hussein needed the vote, but it was like, okay, let's do it. You know, let's just do it. Yeah. Why not?
Yeah. My third question is, yeah.
Sorry, it's by the way, if you look at the strategy employed by the Muslim Brotherhood, right? And the strategy employed by the RSS, it's implicit in what they're doing. It's in there, right? They're basically saying capture power through the electoral process, capture the institutions, and then the electoral process is irrelevant.
Okay. My third question is about foreign policy and international relations. Everyone has noted, and rightly so, that China is now a new global superpower. And certainly in the United States, but in much of the Western world, the notion that there is a serious rivalry emerging between the United States on the one hand as the leading superpower and China as the emerging superpower, that rivalry is seriously underway now. What are the implications of China's rise to a global superpower status? What are its implications for India, according to you?
I mean, again, China's rise has been taking place for some time now. And for example, the success the Chinese have had in manufacturing is causing some of our political tremors, right? The Trump supporters, a lot of the Trump supporters and a lot of the supporters of the BJP, they are Trump supporters and BJP supporters because of large-scale joblessness. That's why then the failure of manufacturing, so to speak. So China's rise has been affecting our politics for some time now. And it affects it in multiple ways. For example, if you go into the details of Karnataka politics was blown apart because of iron ore exports to China, right? So it affects it at the state level, it affects it at the national level. That's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is the Chinese clearly have a strategy. It's very clear. And the strategy is take the terrestrial vision. And it's a economic strategy. It has a military strategy, but it isn't essentially an economic strategy. What they're presenting to people who are countries and saying, look, we will help you rise. There is no counter strategy to that. So we work with the Americans. We have a partnership with Americans. We are two democracies. We have a lot in common, but there is no clear strategy of prosperity between the United States and her allies. I don't see it. So to me, that is something that has to be figured out. And if you're going to, of course, you don't want to go into a conflict, but if you're going to go into a successful competition, you need to have a strategy of prosperity.
In other words, the primary plank of Indian strategy towards China, according to you, should be economic, a search for economic prosperity, policies that promote economic prosperity would be the best way to deal with China rather than something else.
It's one step further than that. Mm-hmm. We have two problems. Well, we have many problems, but centrally, there is an issue with the Chinese rise, but there is a massive issue with job creation in India, with our economic situation in India. We have to resolve that problem. And I'm not one who believes that we can resolve that problem through the services route. I just don't think it's possible. So what does it mean? It means that it is a strategy for, then India certainly cannot have a global position, certainly cannot take on the challenges that are coming from the Chinese. And that is not to say you don't need a military strategy. Of course you do.
Okay, and my last question in elections. In December 2018, your party won 3 states, and the narrative in the country was Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and Chhattisgarh. Chhattisgarh was a huge victory. And the narrative by January of 2019 was that Congress party.
Facebook, WhatsApp, social media dominance, yeah, could be. But those are some of the reasons. You see, again, if you look at the amount of money the BJP is throwing at elections, compare them to what we are doing or what other political parties are doing, no comparison. It's a ratio of 1:10, right? More. You look at the media, the Prime Minister is 24/7 in the media. Nobody else is there. No other leaders on the television, right? So there's total domination of that stuff. And then in addition to that, you also have domination of institutions. So to me, it is massive concentration of political and financial power that is sitting behind this machine.
And that explains the 2019 substantial extent, you argue.
I still don't understand the Chhattisgarh going from a sweep, with a solid set of candidates to 2 seats. I still can't explain it, but the explanations that are given to me, I'm like, okay, maybe.
Okay. Thank you, Rahul. My half hour is up. So let's bring the faculty panel in. The first colleague of mine who's going to ask you a question is Andrew Foster. He is the George and Nancy Parker Professor of Economics. And Andrew, you are on screen.
Right. Yes. Well, thank you for giving me this opportunity. So I wanted to sort of recognize you've called for the repeal of the farm laws, but also note that there's sort of considered view that rural poverty in India will remain a major issue as long as there's so many small and marginal farmers, and as long as the supply chains operate, they do. So I'm wondering if you can give us an alternative vision, both of sort of how transformation is likely to happen or should happen over the 5 and 10 years, and what kinds of policies will help make that happen.
Yeah. So what we are against, first of all, we agree that a reform of the agricultural system is required. We also feel that any reform of the agricultural system has to come out of a conversation with the stakeholders of that system. Who are the stakeholders of that system? Farmers, producers, people who manage that system, etc. Our first problem with the farm laws is that there is no conversation that has taken place with stakeholders. They're not even explained what is happening. The second thing is, to me, the thing you have to look at, it's not a complicated thing, right? I think you will need to also transform our agricultural system from a jobs perspective. So you will also have to bring in technology, bring in those nodes into that system so done properly. So we're not arguing for no reform of the agricultural system. We're arguing for a reform, but a reform that carries the stakeholder and listens to the stakeholder and involves the stakeholder. I mean, there are many successes they're going to do. Mm-hmm. So what you're seeing in Punjab right now, if the laws go through, you will see that at a massive scale. It'll come slowly, but when it comes, then the negotiation is not possible. So the negotiation is, you have to see, if you think about it, India is going through a transformation. It's going through from a rural to an urban transformation. And in a sense, the imagination is changing. So you have to help people through that imagination. You can't just say, sorry, boss, now you have this imagination, I'm going to explode it for you. And, oh, by the way, figure out your imagination on your own.
Fair enough.
Right? It's the same thing they did with GST, right? We are for a GST, but negotiate the thing. Go through the conversation. And once you're ready with the conversation, everything's ready to go, then do it. Right? It's the idea. See, if you ask me, it is massive concentration of capital, 5 or 7 people, massive concentration of political power, which gives the illusion that you don't have to negotiate with anybody. But then when you put the thing into practice, the power of these forces becomes very apparent. And then you're suddenly like, oh my God, what just happened, right? So that's the problem. And I don't think it's simply a Narendra Modi issue. I actually think that the negotiation within the Indian system is struggling. Hitler tried to do it, right?
Sure.
Hitler basically said, listen, I can run Europe. I don't need to talk to the French. I don't need to talk to the Italians. I'm going to run Europe. You see what happened to him. Right?
Rahul, are you saying that a better
country? When I go to Tamil Nadu, when I'm going and giving a speech in Tamil Nadu, it's part of the negotiation. I'm going there and they're saying, okay, what is the contract that Tamil Nadu is going to have with the rest of India? Right? It's embedded in the system. If you attack that, you will not realize, but the blowback that will come will be unstoppable. So that's how I see it.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much.
I'll give you, Andrew, one more thing I'll say.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you look at what happened to Pakistan, this is exactly what happened to Pakistan. The negotiation ethnicities of Pakistan was dominated by the Punjabis. And the institutional structure that did it was the Pakistani army. Right? And then you had a democratic framework crumbled. Because the only way now, once you've broken the negotiating framework, the only way to keep it together is force.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Let's turn to Leela Gandhi. She's joining us from London, as I said. John Hawkes Professor of the Humanities and English. Leela.
Mr. Gandhi, on the heels of that beautiful thought about negotiated imagination, the concept of Swaraj, self-rule, was of course a rallying cry for the Congress party in the early decades of the 20th century. It was a such mean, if anything, to Congress leadership in the 20th century and to you personally.
See, the idea of India if you look at how India was put together and modern India and the role of Gandhiji in that bringing India together, I am dead. Meaning I have no game in this conversation, right? So he in a sense, if you say, he became shunyata, right? And then that conversation actually started. Without that thing, without Gandhi, the negotiation wouldn't have begun, right? So the idea of India itself required a introspection into the self and then an attack onto the self. And frankly, if you want to keep India together, you've got to do that. If you don't do that, if there is no shunyata in the negotiation, then it's not going to work. That's what the Congress brings to the table, right?
Shunyata.
The idea, right now, with the force that you're fighting, that, I mean, Gandhi would not have been Gandhi without the force that he was fighting.
You've said something really extraordinarily beautiful, but I think this is you and not necessarily the Congress party, and you've replaced my idea of Swaraj with a really beautiful idea of Shunyata, and I want to throw you out on this.
No, you'd be surprised. You'd be very, very surprised. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Congress workers who have this idea. Hundreds and hundreds. Problem is, they're not in power. But they're there. I can tell you name after name after name after name who is sitting there and literally doing harakiri, right? Political, he's eating himself. It's the opposite of the RSS. This is not a new thing, to attack your sense of self. And I'm very happy with you because you attack my sense of self every morning. So I love it because it gives me, in a sense, it's a very strange thing.
Spiritual gift.
No, I just think that, my God, this is amazing. I think, when you're facing a political force, people don't, when they were faced by the British, is you are enslaved, not because the British are powerful, but because you're refusing to look into yourself. And that's all he taught us.
True. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Love that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well,
Let's turn to, we have 10 more minutes for the, 10 more minutes for the faculty panel. Patrick, you have 5 minutes and Prerna will have 5 minutes. Patrick Heller, Lindcross Professor of Sociology.
Thank you, Ashu. Thank you, Mr. Gandhi, for being with us today. I want to pick up on this theme of negotiation, which I find in the 10 years that Congress was in power. And looking back on it now, I think we've all come to realize increasingly that the great legacy of the UPA government was building the basic architecture of the Indian welfare state, a truly remarkable set of interventions. And so I've two related questions. One, given just how successful NREGA and the other welfare and rights-based interventions were and how encompassing they were, why didn't this translate into more electoral success? How do we explain 2015?
Very profound question.
Yeah, and so in part also it was the BJP's victory in 2014 kind of an elite reaction, an upper class reaction against this expansion of rights, and then welfare state and on social rights in general.
We understood in 2004, 2005 that large numbers of our people were transforming their imagination. So they were going from a rural imagination to a completely new space. And this is not understood by somebody who hasn't made this transition. But if you've spent time working in that space, you will realize this is a terrifying thing. This is not an easy thing to do. And it generates tremendous anger, fear, panic. And we understood that we have to put a floor under these people as they make this transition. So we have to do something so that this change of imagination happens across a bridge. They don't need to just jump, right? And that was NREGA, that was right to food, that was all those paradigms. We got a massive reaction because this was a cost on certain elites, right? So farmers didn't like NREGA, right? So what did we do? As the Congress does, the Congress searches for pain. People say left or right. No, it looks for pain and it manages pain. So we did NREGA, farmers felt pain. We did the 72,000 crore farmer relief package, right? So we managed that pain. But the concentration of power that has happened, concentration of political power through the RSS, concentration of economic power through the 5, 7, 10 crony capitalists, essentially translated into massive political power across the board. And it just overwhelmed all that. Of course, in 2014, we had a problem. The vision that you're talking about was running out of steam. It was actually a 1990s vision, repurposed and with some additions in 2004. And it worked very well for 8 years. And I remember I was with one of my colleagues in 2008 I think it was 11, and we were driving, and we said to each other, this vision is not working anymore. It's not working, right? So we came to the institutions, and they've spent a lot of time and effort. They're putting in sort of their people.
Thank you.
But my guess is, if you don't do it, which the BJP is not doing, you will enter as
Stanford.
Hello.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gandhi. I think today you've spoken very thoughtfully, very powerfully about two themes that I wanted to pick up on. The first was about this control of the narrative by the BJP, and the second about this assault on institutions. And so, as has come out in your conversation, especially with Professor Gandhi today, you're putting forward this secular, inclusive idea of India, which stands in stark contrast to that some control over, which is the Congress party. So, as a political scientist, when I follow the trajectory of the Congress, I learn in a kind of politics of India class that you might take about something that happened to the Congress really beginning in the late 1960s under Mrs. Gandhi, which was the deinstitutionalization of the Congress and the personalization of power. And today you've spoken a lot about the role of the RSS and the Shakha structure in the way in which the BJP is effective. And I think as you just said in response to Professor Heller's question, has been really instrumental in kind of spreading the message and indeed rooting the message, we might say, of Hindu nationalism among the people. And so I was wondering, how would you think of the role of the Congress, because it was deinstitutionalized in the 1960s? One of the arguments that's put forward is that this cadre structure of the organization as it enters the hinterland is what was destroyed or at least weakened. And so how are you thinking of the civil roots organizational structure of the Congress? What role does that play in the kind of spread of this alternate narrative? The point about the personalization of power, this is definitely something that you've pointed out has happened in the BJP, but to what extent has it happened in the Congress? And what do you think of the place, the potential, but also the challenge of dynastic politics?
The Congress party has never had a cadre, and it doesn't believe in a cadre. And the day the Congress party has a cadre, it becomes the BJP. A cadre is a person who puts out a particular message. He's a pracharak. He puts out a particular ideology. That's not what a Congress worker does. A Congress worker manages a negotiation. Two fundamentally different things. This idea that there was a Congress party that had these, workers in brown shorts that used to do all this is just wrong. It has never existed. What the Congress party had were people coming out of these movements that were negotiating settlements. And our big negotiator was Mahatma Gandhi. And then there was Nehru and others, right? But the Congress has never had a structure that goes out and puts across its message. That's just not what we do. That's what the RSS does. That's what the BSP does. We don't need a cadre. We don't want a cadre. What we want is people who manage who operate as the bridge between communities, right? That's one. Second thing, the Congress, in the split of the Congress, was an ideological fight in the Congress, which was won by the left. You can call it the left, but it was won by a particular ideology in the Congress. The dismantling, so to speak, of the institutions of the Congress was essentially the right of center people leaving. The idea that no one replaced them is fantasy, right? Devaraj Ars and our entire Congress operation in Karnataka, they were formidable politicians who replaced those people, right? Of course, Indira Gandhi had a role there, right? But the notion that Congress is a cadre-based party and there's these lines of people getting ready to put them as this is not what the Congress is. It's a misunderstanding of the idea of the Congress. I'll give you, and I learned this the hard way. So this is not something that came naturally here. So my first 3-4 years in the Congress, I just used to sit there and be like, what are these people doing? So we would sit there and they would just go on and on and on and on. Just and I would say that I would walk out and say, well, ye kya ho raha hai? Why are these people just having this conversation, ongoing conversation? And a lot of the time they just repeat what they were saying. So one guy would say it, a second guy would say it, third guy would say it. And I was like, what is this going on? Right? When there is no negotiation taking place between the Hindu and the Muslim, or the Sikh and the Hindu, or the Tamil and the Bengali, we have a problem. Our problem is not an organizational problem. And what I'm saying to you here is that I'm worried that the conversation in India is stopping. And it's the systems that allow that conversation to take place are collapsing. And I know what happens in the Congress party when we stop the conversation. In a small little place. 1.3 billion people. And that's the challenge that the Congress party is facing, in addition to the media dominance, the Facebook, WhatsApp, and all this stuff. The good news is that we're learning and we're getting people who would never, ever come and work with us to work with us. Right? So there's a So that, of course, happens within our system. So you never see it.
So this is an argument that without a comprehensive conversation.
And Tito's wife, this old lady, had these 2 little puppies. We were playing with the puppies. My grandmother and my mother were talking to her. And I could overhear the conversation. And my grandmother asked her, so how are you doing? And she says to me, I'm doing okay. She says to my grandmother. And then my grandmother says, how is Yugoslavia? And she looked at my grandmother and she said, oh, Yugoslavia doesn't exist anymore. So my grandmother said, but why? She says, what are you saying? And she said, well, because the relationship, I had heard this and we were walking out and my mother asked my grandmother the question. And she said, Mummy, what is this woman saying? Like, Yugoslavia is not broken. And my grandmother.
Thank you, Prerna.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Prerna. Let's turn to our students. Is Bhanu joining us from Shimla, or do we have Bhanu? I can't see him. Let's turn to Arushi Kalra. Arushi, are you here?
Yeah, I am.
Arushi, you'll be on screen shortly. Yeah.
I had a question that relates to Professor.
Arushi is a PhD student in economics. Yeah.
I had a question that relates to Professor Patrick Heller's question. I was wondering why universal basic income, which you sort of hinted at in your response before, in the form of Nyay in Congress's election manifesto in 2019, did not take off electorally as one would have hoped for.
As I said, total dominance of the instruments of narrative creation. Look at the television during the time and see how many times Prime Minister Modi was mentioned and how many times Nyay was mentioned. So it is massive financial sort of domination and massive narrative control. Just go home, put on the TV, and look at the time you see the Prime Minister on television versus the time you see opposition leaders on television, and that will give you the answer. I need a fair media to put my message across. I need a fair social media setup to put my message across. If I can't put my message across, those are the instruments I have.
Thank you, Arushi. Bhanu
you.
has joined us from Shimla. Bhanu, your question. Bhanu Joshi is a PhD student in political science.
Hi, Rahul.
Hello.
Thank you for doing this. So my question is related to your comments about urban India, where 35% of Indians, now stay. So now the Congress Party has never really thought of our cities, towns and kasbas in imagination, as you put it, of the local urban state and welfare architecture. So to summarize, why is the Congress not excited about urban India as electoral constituency?
No, it is excited about urban India. But the Congress, essentially, if you look at the role of the Congress in its post-independence early days, it was arbitraging rural power. It was managing the negotiation in rural India between the farmers, between the traders. That was what it was, between the laborers. It was managing that negotiation. A lot of our rural leaders. Our problem in Gujarat, for example, is our leaders are predominantly rural. They understand very well how to do the rural politics. But there is a contradiction between rural politics and urban politics. So when you're asking the question outside Mumbai, what are you going to do with water? My rural MLAs will say, listen, please send it to. So when you're asking the question outside Mumbai, what are you going to do with water? My rural MLAs will say, listen, please send it to the fields. My urban MLAs will say, no, please don't send it to the fields, send it. You are creating a situation where there are simply too many people who don't have a future and they're living in the urban area. India does not have a job creation vision. It just does not, right? And without a job creation vision, without value addition, without transforming agriculture, you're not going to solve that problem. People are going to the city India. Rural India has traditional mechanisms. India has been a rural country for thousands of years. Our political system emerges from those mechanisms. A panchayat is not a new thing. Panchayati Raj is not 50 years old. It's thousands of years old, right? There is no such organic idea of a city. The idea of a city, if you ask me, the single biggest issue is decentralization of power. That you have to give more power to local body people, ward people in the urban areas. They're not, in North India, a mayor is palace.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In the interest of time, let's take two questions now together. So one is Sebastian Lusek in Delhi, and then second is Poulomi Chakravarti sitting here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Sebastian Rahul took a BA from Brown, and has been working in Delhi for over a year. And Poulomi took a PhD from Brown, is currently a postdoctoral scholar at Harvard, and also on the faculty at Queen's University in Canada. So why don't you, and she's a political scientist. So Sebastian and Poulomi, go ahead with your questions and make it briefer if possible. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Gandhi, for joining us. My question for you is, on some issues, politicians can play a role in leading the people, while on other issues, politicians' actions and statements must be led by the preferences of the people. Over the course of you're
wearing that shirt. You might think that you wore that shirt on your own, but you couldn't wear that shirt without the person who made it. You couldn't wear the shirt without the person who made the buttons. You couldn't make the shirt without the guy who opened the door to the factory, etc., etc. So I don't think there is this notion that, oh, I came up with this idea. And there isn't also a notion that, oh, they came up with the idea. It sort of merges. One merges into the other, and then you get an outcome. I like to keep my ears open. And I find that I get huge amount of ideas from people that can inform my decisions. I'd be very worried making decisions, huge amount of ideas from people that can inform my decisions. I'd be very worried making decisions, political decisions, without being informed and without listening.
Congress together. But this can also be limiting, right? It's limiting in the sense that it does not allow for new leadership to flourish. And it also does not allow the space for a new political ideology to emerge that is more relevant to our times. And I know that you've stepped down as the president recently of the Congress Party, but my question to you is the following. I mean, given the crisis at hand, and we know that the last few years have not been great, would the Gandhi family be willing to step aside from their control of the Congress Party and to let new leadership flourish?
Look, the point is that I am fighting a ideological war. I believe in certain ideas and I defend those ideas. And I don't really care what my name is. Doesn't make me any difference. I don't even care who my grandfather was, I don't care about any of that. But there are certain ideas that I defend. I mean, whether anybody likes it or not, I'm going to defend them, right? Now, what's interesting to me is that nobody in my family has been prime minister for what? Since 89, right? 99, so 20, 21 years, no, 30 years, 30 years. But there is an obsession that somehow we are in power, etc., etc. I have a role to play in the Congress Party. The role to play in the Congress Party is I defend a particular ideological current in the Congress Party. And that's I believe strongly in that. I'm certainly not going to say, okay, thank you. I defend a particular ideological current in the Congress Party. And that's I believe strongly in that. I'm certainly not going to say, okay, thank you. I'm attacked every morning by the BJP. Every morning I'm kicked. I'm the only person, right, who actually sits there and attacks the Prime Minister. The Congress Party, who has been pushing elections in the Congress Party from day one. I've been mauled in the press because I push elections. Please just do a search on internal democracy in the Congress Party and see the amount of abuse I got for it. It's interesting to me. When I'm pushing internal democracy, everybody's saying don't push it. Have you ever heard me say that the Congress Party should not have elections? I've never said it. Right? And by the way, the next step, of course, is interesting, which is neither does the BJP have an election, neither does the BSP have an election, neither does any other political party have an election. But for some reason, which I agree with, because I believe that we have a bigger responsibility for some of the reasons that I outlined earlier. I believe that we should absolutely have elections and we should absolutely elect our leaders. But it's interesting to me that that's not something people expect of any other party. Nobody's ever said, I've never read in the newspaper, why is Mayawati ji not having elections? Never heard it. I've never heard that, why is the BJP not having an election? Why is there not an election in the RS? I never heard it. It's fascinating to me. And the reason is clear. The reason is because people don't like the negotiation. The problem is the negotiation. They don't like this conversation that takes place in the Congress.
Alko, go ahead. Go ahead. He is a senior in computer science, last year of computer science. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. And thank you, sir, for spending your time with us today. I wanted to ask you more inwardly reflective. Was there a specific moment in your life when you decided to dedicate yourself to public service, and what drove you to do so?
No, it's a sort of evolution. There's no
last assigned minute of this conversation on behalf of Brown University, Center for Contemporary South Asia, and Watson Institute at Brown. Let me express my profound thanks to Rahul Gandhi for giving us 90 minutes of his time, discussing a wide range economics to politics to spirituality. The idea of shunyata is going to make news, that you have to forget your existence
in India. And as a politician, that would be something I would love to do. I would love to hear what they say. I'd like to listen to their criticism. I'd like to understand what they're saying. I'd like to inform them of what I'm seeing, but I'm not allowed.
Thank you very much, Rahul Gandhi, for your time. This video, the video of this conversation, will go on our YouTube channel.